Alrighty, everybody, we just got the patch notes in for the Season 9 PTR. This is what's going to be coming in the PTR that we're going to be able to test for Season 9. And then after this point, the developers typically take a lot of our feedback, fully innovate on the changes that they made. And the numbers that you're looking at behind me here are the mad ravings of me trying to figure out in any legitimate way what kind of impact all of these things are going to have on my beloved class, the Necromancer. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to waste your time. I'm going to immediately show you my findings. These findings are going to communicate something very specifically that I want to make sure you have the full context for right now. The number that is the most important is this number right here, the base pit tier. What does that refer to? The base pit tier refers to what, walking into Season 9's PTR, your eternal character would do. This is calculating the difference in their relative strength based off of the patch notes that we've already gotten, as well as removing the current damage multiplication that they gain from the powers in Season 8. Because we're using the Season 8 clears, we're using the change in the numbers here, and then we're using the removal of those things to get an idea of the base. The reason why the base is so important is because that's going to tell us what builds should expect to do if we ignore powers in general. The reason why we have to calculate based off of that is because, one, we've literally never seen these new Haradrim spells, and while there's a lot of interesting things that we can do, I think anyone right now trying to tell you one, best powers, or two, exactly how they're going to work is blowing so much smoke up your butt, it's almost not worth your time to listen. Now, there's a lot that goes into how we arrived at these numbers. And for everybody who is interested in better understanding those things, I'm going to explain them in the next timestamp. But just to give you my general feeling of what I'm looking at right now and how effed are we, how cooked are we, how much do they break our class? The answer is, other than needing to figure out how to survive without barrier, we're actually kind of completely fine. So let's just go through all of your favorite builds right now and give you an idea of what your eternal character in Season 9 will be able to accomplish before you equip any of the borrowed power from that season. Sever, probably one of my favorite darkness builds, is still going to be clearing above tier 90 in the pit. Blight is still going to be clearing tier 86, maybe 87. Infinimist, who knows on that one? I haven't even played it yet. It's a completely dead build, but it'll probably be somewhere around tier 75 to tier 80. Bloodwave still clearing over tier 100, so I'm calculating it somewhere between tier 102 or tier 103. Overpowered Bone Storm, which is a build that you can do. I have a build guide on my channel right now if you want to go check it out. It's not on Maxwell because it's not like a thing I really recommend, but it's really good for speed farming. That bad boy will be clearing just around pit tier 75. We have Bone Spirit. Bone Spirit actually got hit pretty hard by all of this, so I think Bone Spirit should be somewhere around like pit tier 84, maybe pit tier 85. Bone Spear, Overpowered Bone Spear, is still going to be hitting over pit tier 102. Minions is actually really close to still clearing pit tier 100, so somewhere around pit tier 98 or 99, and that's because of the gloves that I absolutely hate, but are still absolutely going to be describing or be defining the meta version of minion builds. Rest in peace to the Golem in its entirety at this point. Blood Surge will be somewhere around pit tier 81. Army of the Dead will be clearing 74 or 75. Blood Lance is going to be clearing near tier 90, so it's going to be clearing out tier 88. And then Affliction, a build you can't currently do, but I can currently clear tier 85 on it, drops all the way down to 68. And that's not really like a build that we need to worry about for in the meta, but I really wanted to highlight it because some of the changes in these patch notes seem really tone deaf in comparison to the relative strength of things, while they're trying to take a very generalized approach to balancing the game in general. Sorry for the redundancy there. But if that's all that you cared about, this is just the baseline of what builds can do, understanding that all of them will become stronger with the borrowed power, I guess you don't have to watch this video any longer. But if you appreciate the quickness at which I gave you the information, didn't make you wait, maybe subscribe to the channel if you're new here, leave a like and leave a comment. I'd love to hear from you. But for all of my big nerds, let's go ahead and talk about a lot of the changes here and their impact and how we got to these numbers. Looking at the list of things that came to the Necromancer as far as skills which were changed, there's not a lot going on here, but probably the biggest change is going to be the change to Soulrift. Now, basically, the developers called it out like it was. Soulrift was so all-encompassing, there was no reason to use any other ultimate in the game. Its biggest benefits were not only giving you a huge amount of utility, but also completely solving survivability with barrier generation, as well as giving damage multiplication. So there wasn't even really an option to go more glass cannon and gain more damage. It was the biggest damage that you can get from an ultimate other than Blood Wave. So they basically said, Porque no los dos, they said, hold my beer, and they stripped away the barrier generation, and they absolutely gutted the damage multiplier. So as opposed to granting you 75% increased damage, it's only 15% increased damage. And that really begs the question, does every single build actually use Soulrift still? And basically, the long and short is that no. Everybody who is already using Soulrift will continue to do so, except for the blood builds, because all the blood builds were using Indira's memory. Because here's the funny part, even Lord Sarah's Bloodlance and Blood Surge build, obviously our Blood Spear build as well, even though all these builds aren't casting Bone Spear, they're all using Indira's memory, because this thing says percentage increase to maximum life, as well as ranks to Tides of Blood. It turns out that this is just stronger than Blood Moon Breaches. But the cool part about these pants is, though, even though they actually nerfed them, so Blood Wave will no longer grant you as much damage multiplication, it does say that Blood Wave does this in general. And if Soulrift is no longer granting you any survivability by not generating barrier, all you really need to solve is vulnerability uptime, which we can do within affix on our ring, as well as essence generation, which we typically do with lucky hit chance to be able to restore essence. And it turns out using Blood Wave will get you survivability, because Blood Wave says every time that you cast it, you gain 20% damage reduction for 10 seconds. And while losing out on full barrier all the time from Soulrift isn't exactly equal to gaining 20% damage reduction, reducing all damage incoming by a fifth is actually very significant. So I'm near positive that basically every single build that can get away with wearing Indira's is going to, just to get the benefits of Blood Wave, not only higher damage than Soulrift was granting, but as well as gaining this survivability. Now, that being said, losing out on this barrier generation from Soulrift is huge. Most builds are going to have to find some way to be able to trigger lucky hit chance at a high enough rate to be able to get it from Necrotic Fortitude, which is interesting in that we don't have necessarily great lucky hit chance on every single build, but nowadays with how many damage instances are occurring all the time, as well as the borrowed power all actually having lucky hit chance, there's a decent opportunity for us to be able to manage it through that. You just basically got to find 3 skill points to be able to get it up to its highest lucky hit chance possible. It also means that some builds might look around at using things like Fists of Fate to be able to further boost their lucky hit chance, just to be able to survive, but we'll have to see what that fallout looks like. The other biggest change to this in general is there are changes to Overpower. The long and short of it is what they gave us was that Overpower additive damage that you get from just stacking maximum life is only going to be about 20% as effective as it was previously, meaning that we're losing out on 80% of our additive damage. But what does it look like when your build that overpowers 100% loses out on 80% of its additive damage, and it doesn't really have great ways to stack it? That means that Overpower builds are going to be doing only 37% of the damage that they were previously. And I don't think everybody necessarily had a great handle on just how much additive damage you were getting from Overpower. So I did the calculation right here. On a build that had 27,000 maximum life, which on the Necromancer is like decently high, but can actually get significantly higher on things like the Barbarian and the Druid, we were gaining a total of 168 times our damage. That is 16,849 total additive damage. When the developers were talking about gaining a couple thousand damage from Overpower, they were vastly underestimating or vastly undershowing how much it really impacted builds. Nowadays, without all that Overpower damage, our additive in total will be multiplying our damage by 62 times. That is a difference of losing out on 64% of your total damage output, going from a 169 multiplier down to a 62 multiplier. That is huge. Now, the thing to keep in mind here, though, is that while the vast majority of Necromancer builds would seek to overpower if they could, a lot of them didn't overpower 100% of the time. And while overpowering would still represent a huge amount of the damage that you do, it wouldn't represent the majority of damage. Builds like Sever as well as Minions do not overpower 100% of the time. So any build which does not is impacted less. To that same end, things like Blood Surge and Bloodlance are going to be negatively impacted by this, a little bit less than the other builds like Blood Wave or Bone Spear, which overpower 100% of the time, because some portion of your damage was non-overpowered damage on these other builds. Because that is near effectively impossible for me to calculate per build, per instance, whether you're doing pit or not doing the pit, etc. I'm just going to apply a rough estimate to builds that I know don't do it 100% of the time, and then everything else that would want to be overpowering 100% of the time, I fully applied that negative. Then there's just one other thing I can't really calculate, and it is the impact of trying to buff basic skills across the board and what that will mean for the Necromancer. If you want to get my TLDR of what I think we should look out for, It is a Shattered Spirit Bone Splinters build. This is the only basic skill build that we can really build into because it actually had enough damage instances to matter. The major issue with the Necromancer is that our basic attacks do not apply special effects for us. They do not apply bleed, they do not apply poison, they don't build into other things, we can't turn them into core skills. We really can't scale basic skills. And the other issue with it is that things like Pain Gorgers tend to not actually translate your crit or your overpower damage out to the echoes of damage. And on top of that, basically our basic skills are only good at doing AoE damage or single target damage, and there's no way to make them good at doing both. Then we could just very quickly talk about the changes to our passive skills and just like kind of how insane they are. Affliction. Remember I talked about Affliction? Affliction, if you did not know right now, can get up to 5,200% damage multiplication. That is a 53 times damage multiplier. How do I know that number? Well, I recently built it. I actually recorded myself doing a tier 80, and I even made the build better. And even though it's currently bugged and doesn't always apply its damage, you can clear tier 80. I was going to show you all this build, but walking into the PTR, they took a 53 times multiplier and reduced it down to a 5 times multiplier. That means that right now, Affliction, just from this change, is going to be doing less than 10% of its current damage. The reason why that's so ridiculous is because up until I just said this right now, I don't think you're out there playing Affliction. There are a few people who mess around with it. I know Bacterial has been messing around with it, and a couple other people in my chat, but it's just not good. Like, it's not an impressive thing. It's just an interesting thing that you can do. So while I understand applying damage caps to our effects so that they don't get out of hand, these things are only getting out of hand because our character sheets get overinflated by how it shows our damage, which not only misinforms the user about how much damage that they have, but then requires them to cap these things. Why is Affliction, a build you've never heard of and haven't played that can only clear out pit tier 80, maybe 85, getting reduced down to 10% of its previous damage? How does that make sense? I honestly don't know, but I figured I'd bring it up because I do think that there's like a fundamental detachment from the impact of these changes and whether or not in the real game circumstance, this is healthy or good. Ossified Essence also got a cap and also got an additional buff, but we literally don't use Ossified Essence even on bone builds because Rathma's Vigor says you deal 100% increased overpower damage, and all of our bone skills are actually just blood skills at this point or an overpower skill. So we literally don't use this. I don't know why it got capped. It clearly wasn't a problem, and it never will be because we're not going to use it. Shadow Blight also got changed in an interesting way. They more than tripled its base damage, and they also capped its bonus damage, but they made it scale off of flat shadow damage as well as damage over time. That's saying a lot, but basically because they've also changed the aspect for the blighted aspect, meaning that Shadow Blight will get a pretty insane amount of damage multiplication. We just can't tell you how impactful that is because we don't know what build will proc it the most efficiently. The long and short is we're going to be testing out Shadow Blight. I don't know what it's going to do. There is a good chance it overperforms and then gets buffed, or rather nerfed, walking out of the PTR into the post-PTR feedback. So I'm not going to hype you up, but we're definitely going to be testing it. If you've been waiting for Shadow Blight to be great again, maybe this is when it's going to happen. And then they changed a lot of the aspects that we had that were underused, and I would like to applaud them here for a lot of interesting things that they did with this. One, they made it so that we can now cause our bone skills to deal shadow damage and increase shadow damage dealt to the target by hitting them with a bone skill. What this means is that both Bone Spear and Bone Spirit are now going to also do shadow damage. So they're going to be either bone and blood skills that overpower and do shadow damage instead of physical damage, or are just bone skills that do shadow damage that overpower. Either way, this means that we need to find another 6 skills in our skill tree to be able to pick up the shadow passives as well. And I think it really opens up some interesting opportunities, like whether or not turning Bone Prison into a darkness skill and it does shadow damage and then it scales with this, like, does that matter? Who knows? Remember the aspect bursting bones? You probably don't, but at one point I got that thing clearing out like pit tier 80, maybe like 3 seasons ago. So we're probably going to have to reinvestigate that as well. Speaking of Bone Prison, they finally gave the skill Blight a damage scaling aspect. So Plunging Darkness says that Bone Prison is now a darkness skill. It's going to cast a pool of Blight, but not only that, Blight will deal 60% damage while Bone Prison is active. meaning that Bone Prison just gained a 120% damage multiplier on a two-hander, and we can finally actually scale its damage in a meaningful way from an aspect, whereas previously it literally didn't have one to its name. This is actually huge because a lot of the time we were trying to figure out whether or not we're going to fit in like Creeping Death or Conceited onto Blight, and that just sucked. So I'm actually really excited about this. We just have to make sure that it'll actually work for its Ebon Piercer bolts as well. We talked about the blighted aspect just a little bit. The Shadow Blight key passive will now do increased damage for each hit, resetting 6 seconds after the first, but we could probably be triggering Shadow Blight like 2 to 3 times per second, depending on what build we're on. So is that after 6 seconds, 18 instances of this thing scaling damage? Who knows? It's per target, so it's not just hitting a bunch of things around you. So it's not going to be like differently effective in a group, but this is definitely something very interesting to look out for as well. They changed Blood Soaked aspect. You not only were never going to use this before, but now it does less damage and you're never going to use it ever again. Although it is now a mobility aspect, but you just don't have room to fit mobility on. And we also already run at 200% movement speed on any darkness build. So no joke, I actually have no idea what this is for. And similarly, Creeping Mist. This is actually an aspect that's been bugged for a super long time. You thought it would work for Infinimist and be awesome. We actually got this sold to us by Adam Jackson back in the day as like potentially too strong and they would have to look into it. Turns out they did. They completely gutted the ability to use it as like a pseudo teleport. And now eating a corpse just makes you run faster, which again, doesn't matter. I guess it'll help during the leveling process or something like that. They nerfed the echoes coming out of Deathless Visage. This isn't as big of a damage loss as you might think it was, or if you're unaware of how effective the echoes were, it's actually a fairly significant one, but basically we're going to be doing somewhere around like 70% of our previous damage. Indira's Memory, like I said, got nerfed. This is only going to negatively impact the builds that are now going to be using Bloodwave just because Soulrift got nerfed. So it's still stronger than it was previously, but it's weaker than what it would currently do if you made the mistake of using it in that way. Bloodless Scream finally works on bosses all the time. Are you going to use this weapon? No, it doesn't say double your damage on skills, and the only skill that would want to use this, because you can get up to 100% double your damage on your boots, which is Sever, has a strictly stronger aspect with no downside on it. So Bloodless Scream continues to be garbage. Dear devs, I promise you I have a way of fixing this. One, you have to put maximum life on a weapon. We cannot afford to not have it on there. And not only that, take away the lucky hit chance and make it so that it just says darkness skills have a chance to deal double damage. So you can put this thing in on Soul Rift or like Shadow Bone Prison or any of the more interesting combinations of uses. There you go. I fixed Bloodless Scream for you. Bloodbath got a huge nerf, and that's the end of the list. That's it. That's the end of the stuff. So luckily, even though the math that I had to do was incredibly esoteric and like weirdly archaic, it wasn't so much that I couldn't get this all done in a single day. And I did want to take just like a couple minutes to very specifically explain the new gloves for the minions and how they're going to work mechanically. And not only that, some of the issues that I see with them and why it's not very clear cut about the exact impact of them, but we're going to try our best. The Necromancer is getting a new pair of gloves, which is kind of funny because the current minion build was using Fists of Fate. So we're actually dropping incredibly powerful gloves to use different gloves. I guess that's the problem when there's so many uniques in the game. But these gloves are very specially tuned for skeleton mages, because you're getting rid of everything else. The base stats on the gloves are kind of interesting: additive skeletal mage damage, attack speed, maximum life, and then skeletal mage mastery. This, along with masterwork critting on it 3 times, as well as a GA on it, is probably going to get us 10 ranks to skeleton mage mastery, which is obviously a lot. You just have to remember that we already had ranks in Skeleton Mage Mastery, and we already had a ton of them. So while this is a large increase in damage, it's not just like gaining 200% damage. People are going to like very quickly try to like reduce it down to that idea, but you always have to compare the previous multiplier to the new multiplier. You can't just look at a new multiplier in a vacuum. But the unique power of these gloves are very interesting. By sacrificing both your warriors and your golem, you are going to replace all of the minions you just sacrificed with more mages. So if you have the base 4 of your warriors, you have a cult dominion on your amulet that gives you 3 more warriors. By sacrificing them and your golem, you're now going to gain a whopping total of 8 more mages. That means 14 mages in total. The big benefit of 14 mages in total is that shadow mages gain 3% damage per mage. 14 mages now is a 42% damage multiplier, whereas previously it was an 18% damage multiplier. That's another thing where I think people might accidentally overinflate the value of this. A difference between a 1.18 and a 1.42 is not nearly as big as gaining 42% damage. So just keep that in mind. But it's going to go even further. Your skeletal mages, after they attack 25 times and don't die, are going to turn into archmages. What do archmages do? Archmages teleport when they get hit. So now you're not going to have any minions to tank for you. There's nothing going to be standing in between you and the missiles that created by like shadow bosses in the pit. You're the tank now is how the developers sold it to us. I don't know how we're going to do that with Soulrift literally not generating barrier, us losing lucky hit chance from Fist of Fate, and not having warriors which attack significantly faster than mages. But somehow you're going to tank it out. Either way, you're going to have a lot more mages running around, and they're going to randomly teleport. Now, when they teleport, they're not going to lose their targeting, but during the time that they're teleporting and then reorienting to attack, they aren't attacking. So this is a DPS loss. Every time they get hit and teleport, they're going to be less efficient than if they were just standing there and taking it to the chest. But in addition to that, occasionally, that is the terminology here, occasionally, their base attack, not their Mendeln procs, but their base attack is going to deal damage in an area around them, as well as gain a 2x damage multiplier. If we assume that this occurs once every 3 attacks, which we don't really have a good way of doing that, but that's me being about as generous as I can be, what this roughly translates to is a 33% damage increase on their base attack, as well as their base attack now doing AoE damage, which is nice for clear. The issue being that it won't scale Mendeln's damage because Mendeln is not your minion's attack. It procs from you by your minions, and then it gains their damage scalars, but this is a damage scaler for their base attack. Not only that, the explosion isn't going to proc Mendeln. Mendeln is based off of the number of attacks that the minion does, literally the number of animations it does, not by the number of targets that they hit. So you're losing out on a damage multiplier for your Mendeln damage to increase the base damage of your minions by about 33% and converting everything over to a mage, making them generally stronger, not only their base damage, but as well as giving them more scalars that are available to them. You no longer have to worry about your warriors in any way. You can regain some of your skill points, but simultaneously, you lose out on the ability to have an additional warrior. Skirmisher could get +1 warrior there. And you're also losing out on a ton of lucky hit procs for being able to reduce your cooldowns. Your Reapers could naturally reduce cooldowns as well as attack in an area around them always. And that meant that they could trigger lucky hit chance multiple times per attack. So this is, without question, a significantly stronger minion build. You're going to be able to use Service and Sacrifice on a 2-handed weapon, and you're basically able to shift your aspects. We're going to drop Grasping Veins, and we're going to pick up Service and Sacrifice, which are now a 3x multi on your weapon, and then we're going to move Reanimation over to the gloves, and we're going to drop Grasping Veins. You're going to have to get a little bit more crit chance to be able to hit cap, but I have some misgivings about this. When your minions are within range of an ad on a boss, they will stop attacking the boss and instead attack the ad. You can't control where your minions end up because they will randomly teleport to an area around you. So there's a good chance that they teleport to you, are now within range of not the boss and in range of the ad instead, and will stop doing damage to the primary target and just swivel over to the boss. Not only that, your warriors were significantly better at proccing Mendeln than your mages are because they just attack somewhere around like 50% slower. There's just no way to get them to attack faster. And then again, they were just worse at triggering lucky hit chance. So all of that being said, it's going to be a strictly stronger minion build. We just have to always sacrifice the golem for this to matter because it just won't work without sacrificing both of them. So it's not even like you could just kind of like toss these on and get the benefit. You have to sacrifice these things to even have a reason to do this. Not only that, you're just never going to use cold mages with this because they don't grant a damage multiplication from having multiple of them out, and you can't use it with bone mages because they have to stay alive for 25 attacks. And even if you heal them, your bone mages just die. So you're never going to use bone mages on this either. And not only that, bone spears and bone splinters from your bone mages don't scale off of their damage, they scale off of your damage. So that's what I currently think about these gloves. Strictly stronger, strictly worse gameplay. I'm hoping that I'm wrong, and I don't know how the Necromancer is going to tank or stay alive when literally none of your minions will stay around you to soak up any of the damage. But now they'll be bigger, and they have lightning effects on their hands, and they'll teleport a bit. I think that this is probably going to be the thing I'm going to test the most in the PTR, because we have to remember the PTR is for giving feedback on the changes, the content, and the balance. We have never walked out of a PTR with the same balance that we walked into a PTR with. So if you have the time, and if you're playing on Battle.net on your PC, please make time to go test these things and give your feedback not only on the subreddit, but on the forums. So if you made it all the way to the end of the video at this point, first and foremost, I just gotta say thank you. Thank you for listening to me yap. Hopefully this helps you to get a better understanding and digest the changes that we've seen in these patch notes and a better idea of what to test walking into the PTR. If you have any questions, let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. If you thought up of any like wacky or cool builds, or you thought of things that you don't think anybody else has really considered yet, please let me know. Again, this is the best time. This is one of those times where like we all get to come together and not only like teach each other stuff, but just like go bananas, right? Like waste all your resources, max out a build, see if it does anything. If you're brand new to the channel, you haven't already, subscribe. What are you doing? Also, if I just come up in your algorithm all the time and you haven't yet, can you check your subscribe button? That would actually mean the world to me. I would really appreciate it. Thank you very much for watching this video. I truly, truly hope that it helps. I look forward to seeing you in the next one.